going to read 3 different articles from the Civil Rights Movement. You're going to be choosing one of these articles to be using for your research paper, but for today we're just going to read them, and then I'm going to have some questions here for you to answer to make sure that you understand what we're reading. Okay, so the first one says the Montgomery bus boycott. Okay, and then see, I have it highlighted, and you're going to get a copy of this when I get back that tells you where this comes from, okay? So, the Montgomery bus boycott was a mass protest against segregation on the city buses of Montgomery, Alabama. Civil rights activists and their supporters began the protest in 1955, and it lasted for 381 days. So think about how many days are in a year. So over a year, right? It led to a U.S. Supreme Court decision declaring that Montgomery's segregation laws on buses were unconstitutional. The bus boycott also brought the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. into the spotlight. He became one of the most important leaders of the American Civil Rights Movement. The boycott began shortly after seamstress Rosa Parks, a black passenger, refused to give her seat up to a white passenger on a Montgomery bus on December 1st, 1955. Local laws stated that African American passengers had to sit at the back of the bus while whites sat in the front. If the white section became full, African Americans had to give up their seats in the back. When Parks refused to give up her seat to a white rider, she was taken to jail. She was later bailed out by a local civil rights leader. Many of Montgomery's African American residents were politically organized long before Parks was arrested. For example, the Women's Political Council, WPC, was founded in 1946. It had been lobbying the city for improved conditions on the buses for a decade before the bus boycott began. In addition, Montgomery had an active branch of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, the NAACP, where Parks also worked as a secretary. Parks was not the first resident of Montgomery to refuse to give up her seat to a white passenger. Colvin, a black teenager, was arrested in March 1955 for refusing to relinquish her bus seat to a white person. However, local civil rights leaders chose Parks' arrest to challenge local segregation laws. The WPC printed and distributed leaflets describing Parks' arrest. They set December 5th, Parks' court date, as a day to boycott the city buses. Civil rights leaders believed that the boycott could be effective because African Americans made up about 75% of the bus riders in Montgomery. Some 90% of the African American residents stayed off the buses on December 5th. The boycott was so successful that local civil rights leaders decided to extend it indefinitely. A group of local ministers formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, MIA, to sustain the boycott and the legal challenge to segregation laws. King, pastor of Dexon Avenue Baptist Church, was elected president of the MIA, a powerful orator. He was new to the area and had few enemies. Local leaders believed he could rally the various factions of the African American community to the cause. The bus companies and Montgomery officials refused to meet the protesters' demands. Retaliation against the African American community was common. King's home was bombed, and many boycotters were threatened or fired from their jobs. Several times, the police arrested protesters and took them to jail. Still, the boycott continued for more than a year. The MIA filed a federal suit against bus segregation. On June 5, 1956, a federal district court declared segregated seating on buses to be unconstitutional. The Supreme Court upheld that ruling in mid-November. The decision went into effect December 20th, 1956. Okay. The next article we're going to read is 1963 March on Washington, a historic demonstration gained freedoms for Black Americans. And up here there is a photograph with a caption here, participants in the 1963 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. Okay. On August 28, 2020, Martin Luther King III stood in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C. as part of a demonstration to fight for changes in the ways that police interact with citizens, especially Black people. Exactly 57 years ago, his father, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., stood in the same spot and gave his famous "I Have a Dream" speech during one of the most important civil rights demonstrations in U.S. history, the 1963 March on Washington. That day, over 250,000 people gathered on the National Mall to demand that people be treated equally, no matter their race. A fight for justice. The March on Washington took place during a nationwide civil rights movement in which Black Americans were fighting to receive the same treatment as white Americans. Although slavery was made illegal in the United States in 1863 by the Emancipation Proclamation, Black people continued to be treated unfairly. For example, beginning in the 1890s, Southern states passed what were called Jim Crow laws that discriminated against Black people and segregated or separated them from white people. The laws varied by state, but they often forced Black people to use different bathrooms from white people, ride in different train cars, or attend different schools. These separate facilities were often in poor condition. Many Southern states also created tests to prevent Black people from voting. Photograph here. Religious and civil rights leaders, including Martin Luther King Jr. He's in the front, second from the right. Black people were also not being hired for jobs they were qualified for, especially government jobs or defense jobs like building warplanes, just because of their race. In 1941, civil rights leader A. Philip Randolph organized a march to protest that. But 6 days before the event, President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed an executive order that banned discrimination in the defense industry and created a group to enforce the order. Randolph called off the march, but 5 years later, Congress stopped funding the enforcement group, and many companies went back to discriminating against Black people. By the 1960s, many Black people were still unemployed or had low-paying jobs, and much of the country was still segregated by race. Civil rights leaders, including King of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference and John Lewis of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, joined with Randolph to organize another change-making demonstration, the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom, the official name of the march. The goal of the march was to urge President John F. Kennedy to pass a civil rights bill that would end segregation in public places like schools, ensure easier access to voting, train and place unemployed workers, and end the practice of not hiring people because of their race. The March on Washington was scheduled for the 100th anniversary of the Emancipation Proclamation. I have a dream. The day of the march was sunny and hot. Marchers arrived at the National Mall on buses and greeted each other with handshakes and hugs. Then they began their peaceful 1 mile walk to the Washington Monument to the Lincoln Memorial. The organizers estimated that perhaps 100,000 people would attend. But that day, about 190,000 black people and about 60,000 white people came to the demonstration. Not a patch of grass could be seen as the marchers squeezed together to hear the speeches in front of the Lincoln Memorial. As marchers cool off their feet in the Lincoln Memorial reflecting pool during the March on Washington. For 3 hours, they heard inspiring messages from the civil rights leaders about keeping up hope in the fight for equality and a better life. John Lewis, who would go on to serve 33 years in Congress, said, "Get in and stay in the streets of every city, every village and hamlet of this nation until true freedom comes, until the revolution of 1776 is complete." King spoke last. 100 years after emancipation, black Americans, he said, were still not free. He said the marchers were there to fulfill the promise of the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence, which guarantees all citizens the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. He said that black people couldn't be free until they have the freedom to visit all public spaces, freedom to enter businesses, freedom to vote, and the freedom from police brutality. Just when it seemed King was ending his speech, gospel singer Mahalia Jackson shouted, "Tell them about the dream." That's when he gave the most remembered line of the day. "I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character." Martin Luther King Jr. addresses the crowd during the March on Washington. Excuse me. Achievements. From the Lincoln Memorial, the leaders walked to the White House, where they met with Kennedy and Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson to demand support on the National Civil Rights Bill. A year later, their demand was granted. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 outlaws discrimination based on race, sex, religion, or national origin. It also ended segregation in all public places and made voter registration easier for everyone. Then, the next year, Congress passed the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It allowed the federal government to overturn state laws that had made it harder for black people to vote. The fight isn't over. Although the 1963 March on Washington brought important changes to the United States, the fight for equality between black and white people isn't over. A 2013 Supreme Court decision struck down part of the Voting Rights Act of 1965 that required some states, especially those with a history of making it hard for black people to vote, to get permission from the federal government to change their voting laws. Since the decision, those states have created new voting rules, such as ones that decrease the amount of time for early voting and throw out ballots cast in the wrong polling station. Some say this is making voting more difficult. Other issues also demonstrate inequality between races. For instance, according to a Harvard University study, black Americans are over 3 times more likely to be killed by police than white Americans. After George Floyd, a black man, was killed by a police officer on May 25, 2020, about 15 million people across the country have protested in support of black lives. Maybe kind of hard to tell, but these are all the people. On the march. And this is the caption that goes with it. The view of the crowd assembled on the National Mall with the Washington Monument in the background. As A. Philip Randolph said at the 1963 March on Washington, the March on Washington is not a climax of our struggle, but a new beginning, not only for the Negro, but for all Americans who thirst for freedom and a better life. Okay, we have one more article we're going to read. And this one is the Little Rock Nine. So again, keep in mind you want to pick one of these that we're going to talk about as one of the important events that you're going to write about. So you're not going to do all of them, so pick which one you think that you're most interested in writing about. Alright, so the Little Rock Nine. 60 years ago, 9 black students made history in Little Rock, Arkansas. Okay, so this was originally from a Scholastic News article. Photograph here. It says U.S. troops escort black students from Central High School in 1957. On September 4th, 1957, Elizabeth Eckford woke up feeling nervous about her first day of school. It was no ordinary first day. Elizabeth and 8 other teens were going to be the first black students to attend Central High School in Little Rock, Arkansas. These students would later become known as the Little Rock Nine. They never made it into the building that day. Elizabeth, then 15 years old, was met at the school by an angry crowd. People in the crowd didn't think black students should go to the same schools as white kids. The mob screamed at Elizabeth and spit at her. "I was afraid for my life," recalls Elizabeth. Elizabeth was shaking with fear, but she kept walking. Troops armed with rifles stood near the school's entrance. She thought they were there to protect her, but instead the troops stopped her and the other black students from entering the school. A photo of Elizabeth walking through the crowd ran in the newspapers across the country. Many people were angry about the way the Little Rock Nine had been treated. Their struggle to go to school became a key event of the civil rights movement. That was a period from the 1950s and 1960s when many black Americans worked hard to end unjust laws based on the color of people's skin. There's a caption that goes with this picture that was here. You can see at school. Kids. And it says, many all-black schools, like this one in Selma, Alabama, were in very poor condition. Kept apart. By the 1950s, the cruel treatment of black Americans had long been a way of life in the United States. Many cities in the South had laws that kept black people segregated or separated from white people. They were forced to eat in separate restaurants and sit in different sections on buses. Black kids, like Elizabeth, were also forced to go to separate schools. The all-black schools were often run down and overcrowded. The white schools usually had newer books and supplies. Black parents across the U.S. grew tired of their kids being shut out of good schools and decided to sue. The famous case was called Brown v. Board of Education. In 1954, the Supreme Court, the most powerful court in the U.S., ruled that segregation in public schools was illegal. But many cities refused to integrate their schools for years after that. Still a struggle. The Little Rock School Board decided to integrate Central High in 1957, but the governor of Arkansas wouldn't allow it to happen. On September 4th, troops with orders from the governor blocked the Little Rock Nine from getting into the school. For nearly 3 weeks, the 9 teens stayed home. Then, President Dwight D. Eisenhower stepped in. He sent more than 1,000 U.S. Army troops to the school. These soldiers were there to protect the Little Rock Nine. Finally, on September 25th, the 9 students attended class at Central High. A difficult year. Once the Little Rock Nine were in school, life didn't get any easier. Soldiers walked with them between classes. But the black students had no protection in classrooms, restrooms, or the cafeteria. They were often harassed by white students, and the black students knew fighting back would get them kicked out of school. One of the 9 was expelled for defending herself. But Elizabeth and the other black students finished the year. Their bravery led all public schools in Little Rock to integrate within the next few years. Today, the Little Rock 9 are remembered as heroes in the fight for equal rights. It is important to take a stand, says Elizabeth. Here's a photograph. Meet the Little Rock 9. So 1, Jefferson Thomas was a track star at his all-black junior high school, but the Little Rock 9 weren't allowed to participate in sports or clubs at Central High. He graduated from Central High in 1960. Thomas died in 2010. In 1958, Ernest Green became the first black student to graduate from Central High. From 1977 to 1981, he served as Assistant Secretary of Labor under President Jimmy Carter. Ninigen Brown was expelled from Central High for standing up to some white students who harassed her. She moved to New York City, where she graduated from high school. She attended college at Southern Illinois University. At age 14, Carletta Walls was the youngest member of the Little Rock 9. In 1960, she became the first black girl to graduate from Central High. She went to college in Colorado. Terrence Roberts completed his first school year at Central High before moving to Los Angeles, where he finished high school. He became a college professor. Gloria Ray's mother was fired from her job working for the Arkansas government because she refused to take Gloria out of Central High. After high school, Gloria studied math and science in college. Number 7, after high school, Melba Patillo earned a journalism degree from San Francisco State University in California. She became a reporter and an author. 8, after high school, Elizabeth Eckford went on to graduate from college and later served in the U.S. Army for 5 years. And 9, Thelma Mothershed was a junior when she entered Central High. After graduating from college in 1964, she was a teacher for 28 years in St. Louis, Missouri.